Hi, I'm Rick Chappell. I'm dressed this way because I'm part of a group called the SCA. That's short for some long and funny sounding words that says we like to pretend we were part of different periods of time, like the medieval or Renaissance periods, so that we can experience what history might have been like and learn much more about it. Today, I'm choosing to be part of Read Across America and read a book by one of my favorite authors. The book I'll be reading today is The Queen Always Wanted to Dance by Mercer. I chose this book because I love the author, and this particular book shows how we need to let people enjoy what they like, and that it can be hard to be king. So let's get started. The Queen Always Wanted to Dance by Mercer. The Queen always wanted to dance, and she danced whenever she could. She danced in the morning while brushing her teeth. She danced in front of her dressing room mirror. She danced through the halls of the palace. She danced with the royal guards. And she danced in the kitchen and upset the cook, who dropped a pot of soup. Once she even danced at court. Every time the Queen danced, people whispered, "Queens aren't supposed to dance. It's undignified. It's unqueenly." This upset the king, a very proper king who never danced nor did anything unkingly. One day he stopped the Queen, who was teaching the royal dancing pig a new step. "I forbid you to dance," said the king. "It's unqueenly, and besides, people are whispering." But the Queen paid him no mind. "I am the Queen, and I can dance whenever I want," she said, and she danced out of the room. This made the king very mad, so he passed a new law. The law read, "Dancing is forbidden in my kingdom, and that includes the Queen. Signed, the King." Now the scullery maid couldn't dance when she took out the royal trash. Dancing was forbidden at parties, and the royal ballet took sewing lessons. Even the royal dancing pig couldn't dance, and in a fit of despair, he swallowed his water dish and became very ill. But most important of all, the Queen could no longer dance, because even a queen must obey the law. Hardly anyone in the kingdom was happy about the new law, except a few people who thought that dancing was a silly waste of time. They patted the king on the back and said, "Your Majesty, you are surely a wise king." And the king was happy because he was certain the Queen would behave properly now. But the Queen decided that even if she couldn't dance, she could sing. She sang at the breakfast table and upset the king, who spilled his coffee. She sang in the barn and alarmed the cows. She sang out the window and startled the window washer, who fell into the royal fish pond and frightened the fish. Once she even sang at court. Every time she sang, people whispered, "That's not queenly. It doesn't look seemly." Finally, the king, who was always kingly and did everything seemly, couldn't stand it any longer. The next day, the Queen was in the kitchen coop singing to the royal chickens. They liked her singing, and they were laying twice as many eggs as before. Suddenly, the king burst in and shouted, "I forbid you to sing! It's unqueenly, and it embarrasses me!" But the Queen paid him no mind. "I am the Queen, and I can sing whenever I want," she sang. The king was so mad that he stamped his foot and broke an egg quite by accident. He passed another law which read, "Singing is forbidden in my kingdom, and that includes the Queen. Signed, the King." Now the milkmaid couldn't sing when she milked the royal cows. The royal chickens stopped laying eggs altogether. Morning birds were forbidden to sing. Everyone overslept, and no one got to school on time. Singing was even forbidden at the royal opera. But most important of all, the Queen couldn't sing, because even a queen must obey the law. The king was happy again. The few people who didn't like dancing didn't like singing either, so they were happy again. "What do you think of my new law?" the king asked the Queen. She just smiled and said, "Now you've gone too far." and almost everyone agreed with her. As the scullery maid mopped the royal floor, she whispered to herself, "This time the king has gone too far." While the milkmaid churned the royal butter, she whispered to herself, "This time the king has gone too far." While the cook beat the royal batter, he whispered to himself, "This time the king has gone too far." Even in libraries, where no one is supposed to talk, people whispered, "This time the king has certainly gone too far." And the whispering was getting louder. But the very few people who thought that singing and dancing was a silly waste of time patted the king on the back and said, "We like the new laws, Your Majesty." By this time, the king wasn't sure whether he was happy or not. He didn't like all this whispering. But after all, the law is the law. Then one day, the scullery maid forgot herself. As she was polishing the royal chandelier, she opened her mouth and sang just a tiny little note. It felt so good that she sang another, and another, and another, and before she knew it, she was singing a whole song. When the king heard her, he shouted, "Singing is against the law! You're under arrest!" The royal guards marched the poor scullery maid off to the royal jail, where she sang to her heart's content. One day, while the milkmaid was carrying 2 very heavy pails of milk, she began to skip, and then she began to hop, and then she began to twirl, and then she began to dance. The king, who was always sneaking around someplace or another, making sure no one broke his new laws, saw her, and he shouted, "Dancing is against the law! You're under arrest!" The royal guards marched the poor milkmaid off to the royal jail, where she danced to her heart's content. Within a few days, the cook, the royal guards, the noblemen and the noble ladies, the royal ballet, and the people in the libraries all began to sing and dance. The royal dancing pig even ate one of the king's slippers, and that made him feel much better. When the king saw and heard all this singing and dancing, he gasped, "The law is the law, and singing and dancing are against the law, so everybody is under arrest." The king marched everybody, even the royal guards, off to jail, where they all sang and danced and had a wonderful party. The only people who were not in jail were the king and the queen, and the few people who thought singing and dancing were a silly waste of time. One day, the queen herself could stand it no longer. At the dinner table, she burst into song. Then she danced around the table, and then she kissed the king, who was about to shout, on the forehead. "I arrest myself," she sang, and she danced off to the royal jail, where everyone was having such a good time. Now the king was all alone with those few people who thought singing and dancing were a silly waste of time. "You have made this kingdom a much better place to live in since you put everyone in jail, Your Majesty," they said. "Shut up," said the king, and he stomped off to bed. All night long he tossed and he turned, and he felt lonely. Finally he could stand it no longer. "I think I've gone too far," he rumbled. He threw back the sheets, sang a song off key, and danced, tripping as he went, down to the jail. He opened the door and he crept in. Everyone, even the queen, stopped singing and dancing, and they stared at him in disbelief. "I arrest myself," he announced meekly. Everyone was too surprised to speak. Suddenly the queen sang, "Hurrah for the king!" at the top of her voice. Then everyone in the jail sang together, "Hurrah for the king and queen!" The party lasted until morning, when the king announced, "The law has been changed." The new law read, "Singing and dancing are permitted in my kingdom, and that includes the queen and the king. Signed, the king." That's a law which almost everyone could agree to. And so almost everyone was happy, except for those few people who couldn't stand singing and dancing. They just left the kingdom, and no one has heard from them since. I hope you enjoyed this. I sure did. Have a great day.